Welcome back to another episode of This Week in Fantasy Basketball News, and we've got a doozy for y'all today. It is, at least the day of the time of this recording, it is the day before training camps open for every team in the NBA. We, as you know, that is the start of a flow of injury news updates, new coaches and new rotations and what they're implementing, who looks good, who's impressing, who's not impressing. This is the time where we get a ton of information that shakes up your fantasy basketball draft board. And it's really important for you to stay on top of everything. Now, news is going to come hot and heavy. There's going to be a ton of it. So these videos look to capture all the biggest stories from the week gone by, summarize them neat and nicely for you so you can proceed, you can go forward with your fantasy drafts and have all the information you need. The blurbs in this video, of course, are brought to you by the Hoopball blurb feed. You can check it out in the description. The best and fastest place on the internet to get breaking NBA news and the fantasy basketball analysis tied directly into it. So go ahead and check that out. And without further ado, everyone, let's dive into our first of three major headline stories that came in this week. And the first one, of course, is the never-ending, ongoing trade saga for Ben Simmons and the Philadelphia 76ers. And, you know, the big news this week, if anything, is more non-news, because we didn't really learn anything new. Adrian Wojnarowski and Shams Charania of The Athletic both reported this week that Ben Simmons has informed the Sixers that he will not be going to training camp. He does not intend to show up, and he does not intend to ever play for the franchise again. This is a story that a lot of local reporters in the Philadelphia area had been pointing to kind of in early to mid-September. This was a situation that was not anywhere close, and now it's caught up to the national media, and they have confirmed for everyone that this is where we stand. Now, frankly, personally, I'm ready for this to be done with. This is a boring story at this point for me. We have talked to death about the Ben Simmons situation in Philadelphia, how much blame he deserves for their playoff faults, the who's right and who's wrong. I don't really care. I want him traded to a new team so we can talk about that and far more interesting NBA stories. But, I mean, here's the situation. As is right now, Philadelphia is still trying, poorly I might add, to convince Ben Simmons to stay. There was a story that came out from Charania yesterday, actually, about how Ben Simmons told players like Joel Embiid, Tobias Harris, and Matisse Thybulle, who were planning to fly out to LA to talk to him, he told them, nah, just save your money, guys. I'm not going to be convinced out of this one. And if Ben Simmons is willing to forego his contract money, which is basically what's going to happen here, the onus on getting this done will pretty much just fall into Daryl Morey and the Philadelphia 76ers hands. It will only happen once they are determined to trade him. They are still looking for a deal that they feel is appropriate. We already know the teams that are interested between Minnesota and Cleveland and San Antonio, whatever. Philadelphia is still looking for third parties. And really, I mean, what's going to motivate this trade to happen sooner than not is if Philadelphia starts the season without Ben Simmons. They come out the gate looking lackluster, mediocre record, pretty poor media coverage. That's the type of thing that's just going to push the chips into the table and just get a deal done, because Philadelphia is just an objectively worse team without Ben Simmons and nobody else coming in to replace him. What does that mean for your fantasy drafts? Well, to me, I'm not drafting Ben Simmons in most scenarios, at least from where he's going right now. He's got an ADP of 55. That's way too early for me to take him with all this uncertainty. And, you know, not only because we don't know when he would actually play his first game in the season, but it's important to know where, too. You kind of need to know the personnel around Ben Simmons to know what kind of expectations we should have for his production. You know, if he goes to Minnesota, where in playing alongside Karl Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards and maybe even D'Angelo Russell, those are three guys who will probably get shots in that offense before he will. And, you know, it's not like Simmons is known for his scoring prowess, but if he's taking less than 10 shots a game, that's not going to be good for his fantasy value, at least certainly drafting him at 55. Now, I mean, let's say if he goes to a situation where, I don't know, he gets traded to the Magic, and there's an argument to be made that he is the primary offensive option on that team, and he's taking 15, 16 shots a game. Well, then that's a very interesting element to tie into his fantasy value. I mean, he might not have as many assists. He doesn't have as good a shooter. He doesn't have a lot of shooters around him. And that's where a lot of his assists come from, his ability to kick out to 3-point bombers. It'd be a weird calculus, but I imagine it'd be easier to justify taking him at that range there. Point being is that there's so much uncertainty, not about the when he plays, but especially the where. Until we kind of know where he'd go, I'd prefer to wait as long as I can to where you are assured value by drafting him. If you can find a way to have him drop to like the 80s range, then go ahead, take a stab at him there. That might pay off for you no matter where he gets traded. But with so much uncertainty, if I were you, I'd make it someone else's problem to draft him. So that's my take on that one. And we will see when that kind of reaches a resolution. The next major story is one that I'm reluctant to talk about, but it's also one that, frankly, you can't avoid the facts of the situation in its relevance to fantasy basketball. And look, this is a story that fantasy basketball is absolutely nothing relative to the important aspects of this conversation, but y'all aren't tuning in to meet the press here. You are here to get fantasy basketball news. So I'm going to talk about the matter of fact about this situation and what it means for your fantasy drafts. And of course, what I'm talking about here is the status of unvaccinated players in the NBA. And let's talk about this first from the perspective of Andrew Wiggins, who this week made his vaccination status made headlines. As we know, Wiggins plays for the Golden State Warriors. The Warriors play in San Francisco, and San Francisco is one of the NBA markets, New York being the other, that have a mandate that all attendees of large gatherings and indoor stadiums, everyone must show proof of vaccination, and that includes players. These are the only two markets that have that rule, and that has a lot of implications for unvaccinated players on these teams. And again, here's just a refresher. These are the three teams that we're talking about here. If Andrew Wiggins at this point, now Wiggins applied for religious exemption from the vaccine and he was denied, which now sets up the scenario for him where he has to either choose to get the vaccine or he goes unvaccinated and then will be barred from playing any home games for the Warriors. That's half of his games. And again, strictly in fantasy basketball terms, the fact is any player on any of these three teams that finds themselves in the situation with Wiggins and chooses to not get vaccinated, they are undraftable in any circumstance. And again, there's so much more important to talk about here, but that's just the fact. There's no argument around it. Doesn't matter how talented a player they are. You can't afford to just wipe out half of the potential games they could play. And that's not even factoring in injuries. That's not even factoring in any other element there. I'm not going to make assumptions on what Wiggins or any players who play for these teams will do. I imagine it'd be a pretty untenable situation to play for one of these teams and choose not to get vaccinated and miss these games. Especially all three of these teams have playoff aspirations, title aspirations as well. I can't imagine teams are going to find ways to work around having their players not being able to play home games in the season and especially the playoffs. So that is just the fantasy advice is just simple there. Again, not going to speculate the status of these players. You can do your own research about players who have publicly come out and said that they don't intend to get the vaccine. It remains to be seen what Wiggins will do in this situation. But again, in terms of how you're going to approach your fantasy drafts from this perspective, it's just a non-starter no matter which way you cut it. And that includes someone like Kyrie Irving, who, again, I don't think there's anything definitive out there on his status, his vaccination status or his plan to get it. And we all know that Kyrie's an opinionated guy, and there's a lot of stuff that's come out about him in a Rolling Stones article that was recently published. But even someone of his talent, what he's capable of, you can't draft him at all if he is missing half of Brooklyn's home games. That's plenty of opinions about that perspective. If you're familiar with my work, you know where I stand on that. Not relevant here. Your stance on the vaccines are not relevant to this conversation in the objective fantasy basketball sense. It just has to be a non-starter. And then it also worth keeping in mind that players that are unvaccinated on other teams that are, aside from these three, they're setting themselves up to miss if you're an Eastern Conference team, those are 5 games that you also have to wipe out entirely because they won't be able to play on the road in Brooklyn or in New York or in San Francisco. So keep that in mind. That is the fantasy basketball, of course, the ever important angle to this story, element of that conversation. The other major story this week is something we can breeze through pretty quick because there's no real fantasy basketball implications yet. But that was the firing of Gerson Rosas, general manager for the Timberwolves for about 2 seasons. As we know, Minnesota, they have just gone through an ownership change. I think in their internal just kind of figuring out the lay of the land for the organization, found a lot of concerning things about Rosas. In particular, he had an inappropriate relationship with one of his staffers, but on top of that as well, a consensual one, but inappropriate regardless, made people uncomfortable. And people were just unhappy with Gerson Rosas' just performance as general manager, people who worked underneath him. So typically a team that, they need reason to make a decision this close to training camp. I mean, they let the guy handle their offseason plans and he made some deals for them. But now he's out. Sanchin Gupta, who was the VP under Rosas, is now in as the general manager. And the thing that you just need to make note of here, and this is just true of any regime change in an NBA front office, once you get to a point where you bring in the new guard, they very quickly will start taking apart the roster in ways that they don't see fit. They don't want to be tied up to the mistakes of the last general manager. So, I mean, look, the NBA season's around the corner. Unless it's a Ben Simmons trade, Minnesota is not going to be overhauling their roster in any meaningful way. But it's going to happen. It could happen as soon as the trade deadline, where Gupta comes in and he decides, like, you know what, Malik Beasley and D'Angelo Russell, that's a little bit of redundancy there. We can move on of one of these guys. He's going to prioritize certain players over another. And that's just something to keep in mind as we get down the road here. It doesn't really have any impact on how I draft any of these guys. But, I mean, one way or another, Ben Simmons trade or not, this is a team that's going to see some overturns between this point in next season. And it could happen as early as the trade deadline. So those are our big headlines. Let's talk about a ton of injury updates that we got from general managers briefing the public before training camps open, your pre-training camp news dump. And we're going to start with Joel Embiid. Biggest name on this list here. We know that Embiid suffered a right meniscus tear in his knee during the playoffs last year, an injury that only forced him out of one game, the closeout game against the Washington Wizards. He played all 7 games against the Atlanta Hawks in the Eastern semis, played large minutes, put up big numbers. And the big headline here is that he's a full go for training camp. He, to my knowledge, had no procedures, surgical or otherwise, done on the knee throughout the offseason. It was the type of thing that I guess it was a really minor tear and it healed on its own over time. And that's really all you can ask for if you want assurances in drafting Joel in fantasy drafts this year. We already know what the deal is with Embiid. He's someone who is injury prone and will surely miss time throughout the season. But if you're going to draft him, you want it to be with a news update like this, that there is no lingering concerns from what happened last year. The knees are real tricky. I doubt that they'd be giving this rosy of an outlook if there was really anything to be concerned with in regards to that knee injury. So I think that you can go ahead without any real hesitation in draft Embiid, given, where you would have given your league settings. So good update for him. Not as great an update for these next 2 guys. We'll start with Klay Thompson in Golden State. The Warriors had a press release talking about the update for Klay Thompson, as well as James Wiseman, who we'll get to in a little bit here. The Klay Thompson update doesn't reveal a ton of new information. It just says that he's progressing and he will be in some controlled drills during training camp, whatever that really means. It's not basketball activities. It's not 3-on-3s, 5-on-5s, anything like that. He's still kind of a ways away from that. At the moment, his target return date is for mid to late December at the earliest, which is something that we already knew beforehand. But this is just an opportunity to once again emphasize that Klay Thompson is not someone that I would target in most fantasy drafts. Really at all, just because there's so much baggage with a guy with 2 devastating knee injuries, missed 2 seasons, and has all this real life importance to the Warriors in playoffs this year, that the regular season is really only going to be used to get him right. And that's not a reliable guy to take, even despite how talented Klay is. I mean, look, I'm not saying that he's going to be so rusty that the 3-point shot's not going to fall anymore, but he's going to play limited minutes. He's going to play limited games. There will be some concerns, some unanswered questions just about his athleticism at this point of his career. Is he still the same guy defensively that he was before both of these injuries? I mean, we don't know really at all what to expect from Clay as far as productivity this season. And for me, save yourself the headache and don't, unless you really the only scenario that I think is fine to take him without hesitation would be a Roto Games Cap format where you maybe are looking for some upside in threes on a per game basis. But even then, I would wait until maybe after the first 120 picks or so to get a shot at Klay Thompson, because you'll find plenty of guys who not only have higher upside, but are just more reliable to produce for you this season. James Wiseman is the sort of newer information, the update that we got on his injury. The rookie last year had knee surgery in April, missed the end of the year. And what we found out is that he is not going to be ready for the start of the NBA season. The Warriors simply said that they expect him to return this season. Super vague, not all that helpful. What that means for your fantasy drafts, well, first of all, I think this is a big plus for Draymond Green's fantasy value because he's going to have to play a lot of center for this team, and that's the area where he excels as a fantasy option the most. And, I imagine Kevon Looney is probably going to start at center. Steve Kerr loves putting him in that role, and it's not a big fan of just starting Draymond there out the gate. But for the most part, Looney will probably not see more than 20 minutes, won't be a fantasy option. And Draymond will take over a lot of the other minutes behind him at that spot, which means that there will be a role for guys to play at the four. In particular, the Warriors have three options that they're going to be rolling at that power forward spot this year besides Draymond, and that is Juan Toscano Anderson, Otto Porter Jr., and Nemanja Bjelica. Those last two are new acquisitions that they made throughout the offseason. Toscano Anderson was actually quite impressive last year, playing some small ball four, in particular in the late part of the year without Wiseman. He was close to a top 100 player with solid contributions and rebounds and assists and steals and threes. And based off of his familiarity with the system and him being a Steve Kerr guy, I imagine that he will get a lot of opportunities to play those minutes at the four, which could be a sneaky source of fantasy value. But Otto Porter is also a guy with a higher ceiling in terms of talent. He's had a ton of injuries throughout his career, particularly the last two seasons. But the Warriors might have interest in seeing if he can get back to a point where, he was a top 100 player in the NBA. He could be of a lot of value to Golden State if he realizes some upside in this system that they play with. And he's got a really good fantasy stat set as well. I don't really have any answers on whether or not you draft any of these 3-4s because I don't think you do. But in terms of storylines to keep track of in Golden State for training camp, I'm definitely going to be looking at that position battle and see which of those three stands out in both training camp and the preseason as well, and see if there's anything that we can make out of that while we wait to get more updates on when we can expect a concrete return for Wiseman. Next story on the board, Pascal Siakam. He had left shoulder surgery and missed the last part of the season for the Raptors. He is now, he seems to be, the update was that he's progressing and that he still figures to be, going a full go in training camp aside from full contact, which I guess is far from a full go, but he will be a participant and he figures to be on the court relatively soon. As you can see here in the blurb, he has the earliest possible return date that he could be back out there for Toronto would be November 1st, which would be, maybe miss 3 games or so to start the year. And we've gone over this a lot. You really tend to want to avoid drafting players who start off the year injured because there's an element of working their way back from rust that you have to consider. And maybe these injuries can linger throughout the year. That last bit, though, is usually more applied to players who have lower body injuries, like stuff with the knees, stuff with the ankles. That's the kind of stuff that can really flare up at different points and can be really tricky to deal with. For Siakam, a shoulder injury is not ideal, but it's not something that's necessarily going to limit his ability to produce. He's currently being drafted. He's an ADP right now of 67, which in a healthy situation on a per game basis is far too low for Siakam. I do get it. I do get that there is some concerns about how much he'll play. He's been involved in trade rumors. Is he a part of this team's future plans? In my read on the situation, I feel that the Raptors are going to try and be competitive to start the year. And Siakam would definitely be a big part of that if that were the case. And he's someone I actually feel pretty comfortable with despite the injury concerns, being able to select him at 67. Safer in roto than he would be in head-to-head, probably. But he is someone that, fought through the shoulder injury throughout most of last season. His percentages were wonky, definitely affected him in that capacity. I mean, he's got solid bounce-back potential if he can stay healthy this year. It has a higher ceiling than a lot of guys you'll find in that 70s pick range where he's going. So I'm looking, optimistic update here, or at least part of the course is what you're looking for. So I'm a little encouraged by that. And he's one of those injured guys that I would probably consider in my fantasy drafts heading up here. Next story, DeAndre Hunter, who also is recovering from a knee injury. He had a right meniscus tear that he suffered in February of last year, missed most of the regular season, came back for the playoffs, re-aggravated it, and then had to have a surgical procedure on the knee. Not an ideal situation health-wise. We learned from Travis Schlenk in a press conference this week that he is going to be a limited participant during training camp, which is also not an ideal update. I've gone on the record that the Hawks are typically a difficult team to get concrete injury information out of, because we saw it all of last year with Hunter, Cam Reddish, Bogdanovich. When those guys were hurt, the Hawks really neglected to ever give firm timetables on any of them returning to action, just sort of optimistic, vague updates, similar to this one that Schlenk gave about Hunter. So he says that he expects him to be 100% ready for the regular season. To me, that's something that I need to see it to believe it. I hope so, for obviously more reasons than one. But if Hunter is limited in any capacity, that does free up opportunities for Kevin Huerter to play more off the bench. Cam Reddish obviously is someone that everyone is honed in on as a guy with high upside that's yet to be realized, and he's going to be backing up Hunter, and just assuming that everyone's healthy. And in particular, I am also very interested in Hunter as a fantasy option himself. I mean, this guy was having a breakout season last year before he got hurt, and I'd love to see if he could continue that at full health with this team at full health. So biggest takeaway here, keep your tabs on the Hunter situation. See if he's playing in these preseason games. If he's not, I'd be pretty concerned about his ability to be ready for the regular season until we get something concrete from him personally, I suppose, is where I'd be looking for on where he is along the lines of recovery. But yeah, if he's not able to suit up, that does have some implications for the rest of the wings in Atlanta. Mitchell Robinson, we also learned something new about an update from, I believe it was Ian Begley, plugged in reporter in New York. He's making progress from a broken right foot last season, but the Knicks are going to take a conservative, slow approach into getting him back out there, which, him not being ready a full go for training camp is, kind of concerning in terms of his ability to be a draftable player. There's a chance that he starts the season backing up Nerlens Noel, who in his own right is just a supercharged, powered up backup who can be a top 100 fantasy contributor even in limited minutes. Mitchell Robinson does need those starters minutes, particularly when his shot blocking is not the highest of high rates that we saw it at when he was a rookie and a sophomore in the NBA. When he was starting last year, we saw a much more conservative Robinson on the floor, trying to avoid getting into foul trouble, as all of these high octane shot blockers tend to do as they get more mature in the NBA. I like Robinson a lot, but he's starting to fall into the category of guys that you should probably avoid unless you get a clearer injury update on. So it's another story to watch heading into training camp. If we find out that Robinson is going to start the year as a backup, that would probably lead more credence to wanting to take Nerlens Noel after the top 100 picks. Frankly, if you can get Mitchell Robinson after the top 100 picks, I'd be happy taking him in that range as well. I just kind of want to know what Tom Thibodeau's full game plan is for his center rotation, who he wants to be the main starter out of that group of two there. So just something to keep tabs on as we go forward. Another story, this one is a rather unfortunate injury update. We learned that Patrick Williams suffered a severe left ankle sprain, and he's going to be sidelined for up to 4 to 6 weeks. That is, that kind of sucks a lot for the Bulls, because Patrick Williams has a big role for this team this year as their defensive ace in the front court. I've talked about Williams on the channel before as someone that I think has an opportunity to get near that top 100 in 9 category leagues because of his defensive stat upside and perhaps even upside as a corner 3 specialist. But the Bulls are going to need him. A severe left ankle sprain is a pretty scary, buzzy kind of way to refer to an injury. So it remains to be seen how good he will be whenever he's able to return. And here's a good something to clarify too. This tweet here from Rob Schaefer. The Williams injury occurred on 9/15, despite the September 15th, despite it being reported 9 days later. So that 4 to 6 week projection range applies to that initial injury date, as he highlights here in this tweet. He could, at his earliest, return a week before the regular season opener, which would be the most ideal scenario. Give him some time to get acclimated to his new teammates, maybe play some preseason games. That's what we would really like to see. The worst case scenario is that he comes back October 27th, which is Bulls will have played 4 games to that point. He's not going to miss a lot of time in that scenario, but you do want a young guy with a lot of expectations and new teammates to have some runway heading into the regular season to get acclimated with those guys, right? So this is the range that we're going to be looking for. This kind of takes Williams off the draft board in a lot of scenarios, but he could be for an interesting pickup should he come back and be ready to go for the start of the regular season with Chicago. So an unfortunate update on a guy I was high on. I will say that if Williams has to miss more time, that this 4 to 6 week timetable is conservative and he actually has to miss more. That means that Derrick Jones Jr. and Alize Johnson are going to be the primary guys playing that power forward position. We talked about Johnson in particular as a very high octane per minute fantasy basketball player, and he'd become pretty interesting to me if he were to get really any sort of consistent playing time. So that's the name to monitor, I believe, of this group of Bulls that could take over. But we'll see. We will see once we get to that point. Another injury update, Dante DiVincenzo. He had that left ankle issue that kept him out for the majority of the Bucks championship playoff run. He's not going to be ready to go for training camp, which means that you are likely going to see Pat Connaughton and Grayson Allen holding down a ton of those shooting guard minutes. The implications are not that significant for either of those two. I'm not interested in either as a fantasy prospect. DiVincenzo, though, is someone that I do think has some upside as a guy who can get you threes and steals and doesn't rely on shot volume to be effective. And this just sort of takes a little bit of optimism out of what he could do to start the year. We'll see. I mean, maybe he gets out there relatively quickly, but that's just another note that you should know for that Bucks rotation coming up. Last story here, we're just going to focus on the Washington Wizards because we got a few updates on some key players for them. Let's start with Rui Hachimura, who projects to be this team's starting power forward. And the Wizards are such a complicated team to project for because they have so many new players, all of which are at a relatively similar level of like talent and competency that is really hard to figure out not only what the starting lineup's going to be, but what the rotation is. But I had figured Rui would be the starting power forward. I think that he is Washington's best long-term prospect. This update, personal reason that's going to keep him out indefinitely. I mean, it is what it is. We don't know anything beyond that. We don't really know what the situation is. Indefinite implies, I mean, there is no timetable, but it seems like it could be a potentially lengthy absence. Of course, we wish all the best to Hachimura and hope that it is something that he's able to return from in a relatively quick manner. But until we know more, this takes him off the board in a lot of areas and does increase the chances for Kyle Kuzma and Davis Bertans to play power forward minutes, and perhaps one of those two starting for the Wizards at that spot until we, again, learn more. Another promising prospect for the Wizards, Deni Avdija, had a pretty bad left ankle fracture towards the end of his rookie season. We learned that he's a ways away from returning still, which means that there will be some more minutes in that front court up for grabs between your small forward types and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and Corey Kispert and even Kuzma to an extent. That's just another thing to take into consideration here. If he's not able to go, that crop of Wizards players that can have a rotation role thins a little bit. I don't think to the point where I'd consider drafting KCP or Kuzma or maybe even Bertans. Maybe I would if I needed the threes, but those two not being part of the equation does thin things a little bit. But the interesting rotation spot I want to talk about is center. We got one more injury update there about Thomas Bryant, who tore his ACL last year. He was their starting center before that. And, we got an update from Tommy Shepard that he was probably going to be back in sometime in December, sort of the Klay Thompson timeline. That's a pretty ambiguous start date. But what it does mean is that it confirms that Daniel Gafford and Montrezl Harrell are going to be your main guys holding down that center spot to start the year. And when Bryant returns, this is what I imagine the pecking order will be for that rotation. I still think that Daniel Gafford is going to be their first guy. I think that he's got the inside track to the starting job. Harrell just tends to make a lot more sense as a reserve big. But even then, I mean, the franchise is high on Bryant. He's a prospect that they'd like to develop. But I think that Daniel Gafford makes a lot more sense for this team long term just because he's a much better defensive option than Thomas Bryant is. The Wizards acquired him at the trade deadline last year, and he impressed in only 18 minutes per game. I think that it remains to be seen what, Wes Unseld Jr. decides to do with his rotation. It's one of those situations where Washington could be rolling with a whole slew of different guys playing different minute shares. But Gafford, to me, is someone he doesn't need a lot of time at all to be a fantasy value guy. And he has the inside track at first opportunities at center. And that will continue once Bryant returns. Daniel Gafford's currently going at outside the top of 110 in Yahoo fantasy drafts. And I think that he's a big time steal at that range, at least for the early parts of the season. I think that, we saw it 18 minutes last year. He was basically a top 100 guy on that alone. Big time shot blocking numbers, big time field goal percentage, and nice rebounds. Just a sneaky guy that you could grab after those first 100 picks, who will definitely give you value to start the season, and I think has the inside track to hold down that job throughout the year. I mean, look, a big factor will be whether or not Bryant can play a normal allotment of minutes recovering from the surgery. But even in a worst case scenario, if all three of these centers here split those 48 center minutes down the middle, Gafford would still have fantasy value because I think he'd still play at least 18 to 20 minutes a night in a starting role. And I think that that'd be enough to get you fantasy value in those categories that I mentioned in particular. So he's someone I'm pretty high on, and this update sort of cements that a little bit more for me on Bryant. And we will see how this rotation shakes out. The Wizards are a really complicated team, like I said. So we will find out more about that once we get there. But that is kind of it. That is all of the updates that we really have here. This is a much longer one than other updates that we've done previously, and that's going to be the case, especially next week once we get every team in the league dumping injury stuff on us. So again, if you appreciate videos like these, let us know in the comments. Please drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like this. A bit of a programming note as well. This week we are going to, we're still working our way through our top 100 series. We're working on some scheduling stuff with that. May not get to the next three parts as quick as this upcoming week, but if not, we have a lot of other videos geared up, strategy focused videos on head-to-head leagues versus roto leagues. We're going to do a dynasty league primer as well, so some really interesting stuff in that capacity for you to keep an eye out for. But no fear, we will definitely finish that top 100 series. Me and Harry have a lot more names to get through, and see which one of us gets closest. So thanks for tuning in, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we will talk with you